You wake before dawn to a hand shaking your shoulder, rough, impatient. The cold bites through the thin blanket as you're pulled from the straw pallet, your breath misting in the darkness. Around you, other boys rise in silence, their faces pale shadows in the pre-dawn gloom. No one speaks. Speaking costs energy you don't have. You stumble toward the cathedral's nave, your bare feet numb against stone that never warms, and as the first shaft of gray light pierces the stained glass high above, you understand with perfect clarity that this day will be exactly like yesterday and the day before, and every day stretching back to the morning. Your mother's hand let go of yours at these very doors. But before we step deeper into this forgotten world, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It absolutely fascinates me that we can gather from across the globe to remember a child whose name no one bothered to write down, connected by nothing but our shared need to understand what it cost to be powerless in the shadow of the powerful. This is England in the year 1247, during the reign of Henry III, when the Catholic Church wielded authority that dwarfed even kings. The great cathedrals rising across Europe weren't merely houses of worship. They were fortresses of influence, accumulating land and wealth through donations, tithes, and political maneuvering that would make modern corporations envious. Behind their magnificence, recorded in parish registers and episcopal accounts that survive in archives from Canterbury to Chartres, existed an infrastructure of servitude. Thousands of children, most between 8 and 12 years old, were given, or more accurately, transferred, to cathedral service by families crushed beneath poverty's wheel. The Church called them oblates, charity cases, servants of God. What they actually were laborers whose childhood ended the moment those massive doors closed behind them. The boy, we'll call him Thomas, though it could have been William or John or any of 100 names long since erased, arrived at the cathedral on a morning much like this one. His parents, tenant farmers who'd watched 3 harvests fail in succession, had made a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The local priest had promised education, salvation, a future beyond the mud and hunger of their village. What they couldn't see, or perhaps chose not to see, was the desperation in their son's eyes as they turned away, his small hand slipping from his mother's grasp for the last time. The cathedral swallowed him whole. His world contracted overnight to stone corridors and endless tasks. Before the sun rose, Thomas was expected to sweep the transept, a space so vast that the far end disappeared into shadow even at midday. The broom was taller than he was. After sweeping came the candles, hundreds of them, each requiring careful tending, wax scraped from holders, wicks trimmed, replacements positioned with precision. A candle extinguished during Mass meant punishment. A candle left burning unattended meant worse. He learned quickly that perfection was the minimum expectation, and mistakes were met with the back of a hand or the sharp crack of a rod across his shoulders. But here's what the cathedral records don't tell you, what you have to piece together from scattered references in monastic chronicles and the rare testimony of those who escaped. These weren't occasional corrections. They were the architecture of control. Thomas existed within a system designed to break the will through relentless scrutiny and capricious discipline. One morning, Father Benedict might pass him in the cloister with barely a glance. The next, the same priest would erupt at the angle of a candle, the dampness of a floorcloth, some microscopic failure invisible to everyone except the man whose authority depended on finding it. The punishment was swift, a strike, a shove, confinement to the cold cellar with nothing but stale bread and the sound of his own breathing. The other boys offered little comfort because comfort was dangerous. To befriend someone was to create a vulnerability the clergy could exploit. Thomas learned this the hard way when he was caught sharing his bread with Edmund, a newer boy who'd arrived hollow-eyed and shaking. They were both beaten for it, Edmund for accepting charity he hadn't earned, Thomas for presuming to dispense kindness that belonged to God alone. After that, Thomas kept his gaze down and his sympathies hidden, though sometimes, in the deep watches of night, He would hear Edmund crying in the darkness and feel his own throat tighten with words he dared not speak. What sustained him, barely, were moments so small they barely qualified as moments at all. The way morning light transformed the stained glass into rivers of sapphire and gold. The distant sound of the choir practicing motets whose Latin he didn't understand, but whose beauty pierced something deep in his chest. Once he discovered a carved angel in a shadowed corner of the ambulatory, its stone face worn smooth by centuries of hands reaching up to touch it. Thomas began visiting that angel in stolen seconds between tasks, running his fingers over the same smooth stone, imagining all the other frightened children who'd sought comfort there. It was the closest thing to prayer he could manage, a silent conversation with something that couldn't punish him for his questions. But the cathedral had no interest in Thomas's interior life. It needed his body, his labor, his absolute obedience. By his second winter there, he'd mastered the art of invisibility, how to move through spaces without drawing attention, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to absorb cruelty without flinching in a way that might invite more. He was becoming what the church required, a perfectly obedient instrument, responsive to command, devoid of inconvenient personhood. The physical toll mounted in ways that wouldn't become visible for years. The constant kneeling on stone left his knees perpetually swollen and tender. Carrying heavy vessels of holy water from the well strained something in his back that never quite healed. The meager diet, mostly bread, thin pottage, occasional scraps from the clergy's table, left him chronically undernourished, his growth stunted, his body burning through its own reserves just to maintain basic functions. Other boys around him developed the same hollow-eyed thinness, the same persistent cough that echoed through the dormitory at night. Thomas was 10 years old when he first witnessed something that shattered what little faith he'd managed to preserve. Father Anselm, one of the senior clergy, had a reputation for being particularly devout, particularly strict. Thomas had learned to avoid him when possible, to make himself small and efficient when avoidance failed. But one afternoon, tasked with cleaning the sacristy, Thomas stumbled upon Father Anselm with another boy, Peter, who served in the choir. What Thomas saw in those terrible seconds he would spend the rest of his abbreviated life trying to unsee. The violence wasn't just physical, it was the corruption of everything the cathedral claimed to represent, enacted in the very shadow of the altar. Thomas backed away, silent, terrified, and when Father Anselm's eyes found his, he saw not shame, but calculation. That night, Thomas was beaten more severely than ever before, officially for breaking a chalice he'd never touched. The message was clear. What you saw doesn't exist unless we say it exists, and if you speak, we will erase you entirely. Peter disappeared within the week. Sent to another parish, the other boys were told, though no one quite believed it. Thomas learned the most important lesson the cathedral had to teach. Truth was whatever the powerful said it was, and justice was a word that meant nothing when you had no one to appeal to. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on something essential in Thomas. The small rebellions that had sustained him, the secret visits to the carved angel, the whispered prayers that were really just questions aimed at an indifferent heaven, began to feel hollow. He was 11 now, no longer a child by medieval standards, but not yet capable of the physical labor expected of older servants. He existed in a liminal space where he was simultaneously too old to inspire sympathy and too young to have value beyond his immediate utility. His body, never robust, began to fail in more serious ways. It started with a fever that wouldn't break. Thomas continued working through it because stopping wasn't an option. Illness was weakness, and weakness was a sin of its own. He swept floors while his vision swam. He lit candles with hands that shook. He knelt through services while his body burned from the inside, sweat soaking through his rough woolen habit. When he finally collapsed during Vespers, tumbling from his position in the side chapel, the response wasn't concern, but annoyance. He was dragged to the infirmary, a drafty stone cell with straw pallets and little else, and left there while the cathedral's rhythm continued without him. The infirmarian, Brother Thomas, the boy finally had a proper name, but only because they needed to distinguish him from the monk, was not unkind, but neither was he equipped to heal what poverty and neglect had broken. Medieval medicine, even in wealthy institutions, relied on bloodletting, herbal poultices, and prayer. The boy's illness, likely a combination of respiratory infection, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion, required rest, nourishment, and warmth, precisely the things the cathedral was unwilling or unable to provide to a servant of his status. He lingered in that dim cell for weeks, his body growing lighter, his breath more labored, while somewhere beyond those walls the spring he would never see was beginning to green the fields. In his delirium, Thomas's mind wandered home. He was 5 again, laughing as his father hoisted him onto his shoulders to see over the crowd at the village fair. He was 7, helping his mother knead bread, the kitchen warm and flour-dusted, her voice humming a melody he'd forgotten until this moment. He was 8, running through fields of wheat with other village children, the sun warm on his face, the future still a bright and open thing. These weren't memories so much as visitations, his mind's desperate attempt to return to a time before the cathedral, before servitude, before the slow erasure of everything that had made him a child rather than a function. The end came quietly on a morning in late April 1252, 5 years after he'd arrived. Brother Thomas found him unresponsive, his breathing barely perceptible, and by the time the morning office concluded, the boy was gone. There was no formal funeral, no recorded burial site. Cathedral accounts from that period make a single notation: provisions for servant Thomas, deceased. 7 shillings to cover the cost of removing and interring his body in the paupers section of the church graveyard, an unmarked plot he would share with dozens of others whose names weren't worth the ink to record them. The cathedral moved on instantly. Another boy, this one named Geoffrey, arrived within days to fill the vacancy. The same tasks needed doing. The same floors required sweeping. The same candles demanded tending. Geoffrey's story would unfold with its own particular cruelties and small rebellions, its own trajectory toward an ending that probably differed very little from Thomas's. The machine required fuel, and children were abundant and cheap. But here's what the cathedral couldn't erase: the carved angel in the ambulatory, worn smooth not just by Thomas's fingers but by generations before and after him. Archaeologists examining medieval cathedrals have found these worn spots everywhere, on door jambs, on column bases, on the feet of statues, silent evidence of hands reaching for comfort, for connection, for something that might hear their unspoken prayers. Thomas's touch is there, molecularly mixed with countless others, a physical record of longing that outlasted the institution that created it. In parish records across medieval Europe, you can find the same pattern repeating: children delivered into cathedral service, cryptic notations of their deaths, the immediate arrival of replacements. Historians estimate that in England alone, thousands of boys cycled through this system across the medieval period, their collective suffering forming the invisible foundation upon which the Church's visible grandeur rested. Some survived to adulthood, emerging with literacy and skills that might lift them slightly above their origins. Most did not. They were worn down, used up, and forgotten, their brief lives a footnote in the ledgers of an institution too powerful to question and too necessary to refuse. Thomas's story isn't exceptional. That's precisely what makes it matter. He wasn't a saint or a rebel or a figure whose name echoes through history. He was ordinary, powerless, and ultimately expendable, which makes him representative of millions whose stories were never told, because no one with the power to record them thought they were worth recording. His life asks us an uncomfortable question. How much of what we call civilization has been built on the silent suffering of those who had no choice but to endure it? The cathedral still stands, magnificent as ever, its stones warmed now by tourist cameras and afternoon light. Visitors admire the soaring arches, the jeweled windows, the acoustic perfection that makes every hymn sound like it's descending directly from heaven. They don't think about the boy who polished those floors until his hands bled, who tended those candles until fever made him too weak to stand, whose body is buried somewhere beneath their feet in earth that long ago dissolved his bones and returned them to the soil. But he's there, not as a ghost, but as a truth. The architecture tries very hard not to speak. Every stone he touched, every surface he cleaned, every shadow he passed through holds the faint impression of a child who deserved better than the world he was born into, and who died without ever knowing that anyone would remember him at all. Stand in that cathedral now, in the early morning before the crowds arrive, and if you're very quiet, you might hear it. The whisper of a broom on stone, the soft shuffle of small feet, the barely audible breathing of a boy who never stopped working, even when his body begged him to rest. History preserved the cathedral in all its glory. It's our job to remember what that glory cost.